I'm the author of a great book about pre-revolutionary Russia. Today, I would like to tell you about the origins of the conflict between Russians and Ukrainians. Let's look at what is being talked about so much right now. The history of Russia remembers difficult times. Once upon a time, some native Russian lands fell under the rule of the other countries. Belarus and right-wing Ukraine became part of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. GalIcia and Kholmshchyna were ceded to Poland. Then, bit by bit, Lithuania and Poland began to unite into one state. In 1385, the Union of Kraevo was concluded. The Grand Duke of Lithuania, Jagiella, married the Polish Queen Jadwiga. In 1569, Poland and Lithuania officially formed a single state, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, also known as Rzeczpospolita. Accordingly, Russian lands that belonged to them at that time also became part of these states. However, their population continued to be Russian and Eastern Orthodox. In these lands, Orthodox meant Russian, Catholic meant Pole, and Catholicism was called the Polish faith. The concept of nation was replaced by the concept of religion. The religious affiliation of the population determined the state affiliation. Therefore, in Grand Duchy of Lithuania and in the Rzeczpospolita, there always was a Catholic proselytism, and there was strong pressure from the authorities toward the conversion of Russian citizens to Catholicism. The Catholic state sought to eradicate the Orthodox faith within its borders. There is an interesting opinion that in the fields of Western Russian, the dispute is about the soul of a Belarusian and Little Russian peasant. The Orthodox population of these lands was steadfast in their faith, so an important event happened, known as the Union of Brest. This happened in 1596 and actually meant an agreement on the conversion of some Orthodox bishops to Catholicism, with the preservation of the Orthodox liturgical practices. This church is called Greek Catholic, in contrast to the traditional Roman Catholic. It was a half-hearted solution that tries to reunite the two branches of the Christianity, and there is some insincerity and ambiguity in it. As it turned out later, it's impossible to reunite them in this way. The state power of the Rzeczpospolita supported the union that was beneficial to it and oppressed dissenters. Orthodoxy was called the servile and the canine faith. Orthodox churches were leased to Jews. There was an Easter song in Galicia until the very beginning of the 20th century. Here comes that man, here comes his brother, he will open the doors of the Church of God, and we will sing a holy song. The keys to the churches belonged to Jews, who opened the doors only for a fee. On an old psalter, there is a record about parishioners who wanted to baptize their child, but were refused by a Jew, since they had only 2 zlotys, while he requested 3 zlotys. Now and then there were conflicts and clashes. The authorities forced people to come to the union under the threat of execution, and many martyrs died for their loyalty to Orthodoxy. In Belarus, Vitebsk Bishop Joseph Atkuntsevich became famous for his atrocities during the imposition of the union. Eventually, he was killed by an angry crowd. Nevertheless, the common people did not accept the union. Saint Athanasius of Brest was one of the most ardent opponents. There was another famous person, Daniel Kushner, the headman of the Assumption Church in the town Mliv. The parishioners of the 2 churches in the Mliv wanted to return to Orthodoxy, but both priests persisted in Uniatism. Then the community of the church, in order to prevent the performance of divine services, hid books, utensils and vestments, not daring only to touch the tabernacle. And Kushner, who was just old peasant, wrapped his hands in a church veil and reverently removed the holy gifts, which were then hidden under the bell tower, along with sacred objects. For this, Kushner was accused of sacrilege and blasphemy. He was arrested On July 29, 1766, he was subjected to a painful execution. His hands were burned and then his head was chopped off. While the peasants did not accept the union, the nobility, one by one, began to accept Catholicism. The princes Ostrogsky, Vishnevetsky, Sangushka, and all the others converted to an alien faith. They became Poles rather than Russians. There is a beautiful poem about it by the famous Russian poet and Slavophile Alexei Khmykov. War, they were burned by the wildfires of Poland. They were lured away, they were captured by noisy fest of Poland. Salt and flattery, deception and flame stole them from us. They are led by an alien banner. They are ruled by an alien voice. Unfortunately, this poem loses a lot in translation. It sounds very poetic in Russian, you can believe me. As for the common people, they were divided. Some peasants, for example, in Kholmras, went to the Union. Others remained in the Orthodoxy in spite of everything. Since Pole and Catholic were synonymous in those lands, if a Russian person has become a Catholic, then the next step for him is to become a Pole. The Catholic clergy made his flock to pray only in Polish language, telling them that God hears prayer only in this language, but does not hear it in Russian. Catholic prayer books were also printed only in Polish. In the 18th century, the Rich Pospolita was divided between Russia, and Austria. Many native Russian lands returned to the Russian state, and Empress Catherine II even made a medal with the inscription, "I returned what was rejected," thereby emphasizing that Russia did not seize someone else's property, but only received its own property back. The returned territories made up the so-called Western region. By the beginning of the 20th century, there were 9 provinces in it: Lithuanian, Vilna, Kovno, Grodno; Belarusian, Minsk, Mogilев, Vitebsk; Ukrainian, Podolsk, Volyn, Kiev, right bank, Ukraine. I must say one more time that the Western region was the Russian and Lithuanian lands, which only temporarily fell under Polish rule, but they cannot be called Polish. There were very few Polish inhabitants here. By the beginning of the 20th century, in Minsk province, 5%, in Mogilев, Kiev and Vitebsk, 3% each, in Podolsk, 2%, in Volyn, 8%. The vast majority of the remaining residents were Russians. By that time, Catholic propaganda had produced extensive results. For example, in Belarus, there were 2 million Russian-speaking Catholics whose ancestors were obviously Russian and Orthodox. The situation of other Russian lands from the Rich Pospolita was even more difficult. Kholmshchyna, the land beyond the western Bug River, part of Volyn, was divided, first between Poland and Austria, then between the Russian Empire and Austria, and in 1815, as part of the Kingdom of Poland, it was ceded to Russia. The unfortunate Kholm region came under the scepter of the Russian Emperor, not directly, but as part of Poland. As for Galicia, it went to Austria. Thus, if the other half of the Galician Volyn Principality, Volyn, was part of Lithuania for about 200 years and a part of the Rich Pospolita for the next 200 years, then Galicia lived under Polish rule for all these 400 years and then fell under Austrian rule. What can I say about the unfortunate Galicia? By the beginning of the 20th century, half of its population were Poles and the other half was Russians, so-called Russians, whose language was different from Russian and whose faith is Greek Catholic. Unlike the Western region, the Union completely won here. All the intelligentsia and the administration are Poles. It was Galicia that became a testing ground for Ukrainophilism, a concept that proclaimed the independence of the Little Russians as a nationality and the Little Russian dialect as a special language, different from Russian language. Here, the Ukrainian law was introduced, an artificial jargon developed by Mikhail Grushevsky, a mixture of Polish and Little Russian, into which Czech, German, Polish and invented words were deliberately added, just not to take something from the Russian language. Neither Russians nor Little Russians understood this language. However, in Galicia it was introduced into the school system, and a 7-year-old child had to study on two languages, equally incomprehensible to him, Polish and the so-called Ukrainian. It's hard to believe, but even for the Western region, joining Russia did not mean the end of oppression. Many more decades passed before the Russian authorities guessed to take some national course in the Western region. At first, by some mistake, the Russian government tried to rely on local Polish-Lithuanians, looking at these provinces as at the Polish ones. There was even a project to annex them to the Kingdom of Poland. As for the religious issue, many peasants wished to return to Orthodoxy, but the Russian government prevented Greek Catholics from converting to Orthodoxy, fearing to quarrel with the Poles. For example, in 1840, the peasants of the Lublin province were forbidden to convert to Orthodoxy. It took two Polish uprisings for the Russian government to realize this mistake and take a course towards a national policy. As a result, in 1839, the Belarusian and the Lithuanian uniates returned to Orthodoxy, and only in 1875 the whole Uniate diocese was reunited with the Orthodox Church. The reunification took place under strong pressure from the Russian authorities. There were clashes between units and troops in Kratulin, Kornitsa, Drylov and other areas. Some people preferred to burn themselves rather than change their fate. Many units converted to Orthodoxy only formally. The inhabitants of home Rus who were considered Orthodox secretly traveled to Krakow, which belonged to Austria-Hungary to those years, to get married or baptize their child according to the Catholic rite. Russian government turned to the left again at the beginning of the 20th century as a result of the First Russian Revolution. On April 17, 1905, Emperor Nicholas II signed a manifesto which allowed to leave Orthodoxy for other Christian confessions. As a result of the true liberal policy of the Russian government, there was a paradoxical situation in the Western region and Kholm region. The national minority was a better position than the natives. To clearly show the difference in their position, the Russian conservative politician Vasily Shulgin described how passengers look at the station of Volyn region. Here is this group of elegant gentlemen before whom the porters are so fussy, with whom the railway authorities go so kindly, who take first-class seats. These are Poles. Here is a large crowd, noisy, shouting. These gentlemen who so fussily rushed to the wagons of the second and third classes. These are Jews. But where are the Russians? It's a big crowd. They have healthy, good-natured faces. Their clothes and shoes are rough. Most of them are barefoot. Here they are propping up the walls or lying side by side on the floor. These are the Russians. And they are traveling in a carriage of the fourth class. Similarly, the rector of the Lithuanian seminary, Archimandrit Ivan Pomer, in his speech compared the position of a humiliated, intimidated Orthodox priest to the position of the successful Catholic priest in a luxury carriage. The view of a squalid half-collapsed Orthodox church with broken windows to the view of a beautiful Catholic church, sparkling with white and gilding. Sometimes Poles committed openly blasphemous acts. The whole of Russia was outraged when two Polish noblemen, Gniezdorf and Żółkowski, hunted foxes in the Orthodox Church of St. Nicholas on December 26, 1905. This church stood in the forest in the Rozhashi tract in the Minsk province. Fleeing from the hunters, the foxes ran into it, hiding under the floor. And the Poles, excited with hunting, continued to pursue their prey even in the church. They let dogs into the church, opened the holy doors, pulled up the floorboards, fired short guns and foxes who ran out from under the floor. When one of the foxes tried to climb the icon of the Savior and the iconostasis, the hunters began shooting at the animal, and 22 bullets hit the shrine. For their part, the Poles have never forgotten the dream of recreating the Rich Pospolitaya within historical and not ethnographic borders. Let's recall an episode from Fyodor Dostoevsky's famous novel, The Brothers Karamazov. When Mitya Karamazov offers to Poles to drink to Russia, they modify his toast. To Russia within the limits before 1772, it is before the first partition of the Rich Pospolitaya. Accordingly, the Poles also claim the western region, which they call the taken region, meaning that this was taken from them.
Теперь выпьем за Россию. Ну, ура!
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 Понял. Ну а вы-то чего?
За Россию. До раздела Польши.
Ото bardzo pekne. Ура!
Therefore, even when these provinces returned to the rule of a Russian emperor, the Poles continued the Polonization of the Russian population of the former Rich Pospolitaya. To do this, they used a number of methods: propaganda, moral and economic pressure, and so on. When the union was officially abolished, the Catholics did not give up and organized secret propaganda among the former unions. It was led by an organization that changed several names. The latter was the Union Guardianship Society. These societies published underground literature and maintained a staff of agents for agitation among former unions. This literature openly said, "Poland is your fatherland." A new round of this process began in the 20th century when the decree on April 17th appeared. After it, the Western region and the Holm region saw the strongest agitation. Bishop Yevlogiy Georgievsky of Holm and Lublin, according to local peasants, said that at that time all the villages were covered with leaflets and pamphlets like with snow. In addition, there was oral propaganda, which was conducted in the villages by Catholic clergy and the traveling Catholic missionaries. They urged the listeners to convert to Catholicism. They called the Orthodox faith the faith of the boorish peasant and cursed schism dog's faith. Some agitators said that the manifesto on April 17th meant the conversion of the emperor himself to Catholicism, that newly minted Catholics would be freed from military service and endowed with a large amount of land, while the Orthodox will be deported to Siberia. That was the purpose of all this propaganda, to force Russians to accept the Polish faith and become Poles. This was expressed by the slogan, which they gained popularity in the whole region: "All Russia is beyond the book." That means beyond the eastern border of the Kingdom of Poland. In addition to propaganda, there was a more effective way: pressure from Catholics with whom the Orthodox dealt every day. Family members, fellow villagers, landowners, and so on. Mixed marriage, where one of the spouses is Orthodox and the other is Catholic, have become a strong weapon of proselytism. The Catholic clergy forced their parishioners to bring their entire family to their faith. Until you succeeded in fulfilling this requirement, you were doing penance of not being allowed to confess and receive Holy Communion. One priest refused to give communion to a dying Catholic woman because there were some Orthodox members in her family. Another one refused to bury a peasant who was married to an Orthodox woman. The third priest advised the woman to leave her Orthodox husband and their 8 children and to return to the home of her Catholic parents. General Anton Denikin, who grew up in such a mixed family in the Warsaw province, recalled how one day his mother returned from the church extremely upset, with tear-stained eyes. It turned out that the priest did not absolve her of her sins and did not allow her to receive Holy Communion, demanding that from that day on she secretly raised her son in Catholicism. Her Orthodox husband had sharp words with the priest, forcing him to abandon his claims, and the boy remained Orthodox. But in other mixed families, Catholics beat their priests and harassed their family members. They beat their children, divorced their spouses, demanding to join Catholicism. It happened that Catholic men baptized newborn babies into the Catholic faith while their wives were weak after childbirth and unable to interfere. Priest Evgeny Gonchulevich from Volyn province said that in such mixed families there is no life but hell, and no concessions from an Orthodox spouse help until the whole family becomes Catholic. He told unhappy fathers and mothers came to me, complained with bitter tears about their hellish life in their family among Catholics, and said, Father, we ourselves may still stand in Orthodoxy. We will endure all these family troubles. We will even endure this mockery and beatings, but our children, not protected by legislation, will all join sooner or later to Catholicism. Bishop Yevlogy told about a 12-year-old girl who told him that her mother had forcibly lured her to a Catholic church, but now she wants to return to Orthodoxy. The bishop also gave another example, when in another village a 13-year-old boy was forcibly lured by his father to a Catholic church after beatings and tortures, from which he lost his mind, ran away from home, but then returned to Orthodoxy and recovered. Catholic villagers living side by side with their Orthodox neighbors also had a way to influence them, domestic harassment, which they used when they felt free. Orthodox peasants were attacked. They were not helped in case of fire or childbirth. Their wells were damaged. Their crops were trampled. Catholics did their best to force their fellow villagers to convert to Catholicism, sometimes forcibly driving them to their own church and enrolling them in their own faith. Bishop Yevlogy told about a peasant from the home region who had to secretly carry his newborn child to a priest at night to be baptized by the Orthodox rite. In his way, he was attacked by another peasant who grabbed the baby and carried him to the Catholic church to be baptized. And when the father wanted to intercede for his son, he was about to kill him with an axe. Orthodox peasants were also pressured from Catholic landlords. The work regime was established according to the calendar of the Catholic Church. That is, farmhands had to work on Orthodox holidays and have days off on Catholic ones. Somewhere Catholics received more fees, somewhere they received a discount on haymaking, somewhere a peasant received the tithes of land for conversion to Catholicism. Sometimes the landowner forbade farmhands to send children to Russian schools. Somewhere in the home region, farmhands to pretend to be Catholics and go to an Orthodox priest 20 miles away at night to confess and take Holy Communion. General Pavel Zavazin, who was the head of the Warsaw Guard Department in 1905, wrote that after the manifesto on April 17th, the Polish landlords announced that they were going to expel from their estates all farmhands who would not convert to Catholicism within 2 weeks. As you can see, the Catholicization and Polonization of the population of the native Russian lands were in full swing. This has produced huge results. After the decree of April 17th, which legalized the conversion from Orthodoxy to other confessions, a mass exodus from Orthodoxy began. Since the union had been abolished, people immediately converted to the Roman Catholic faith. The scale of this conversion was amazing. From April 17, 1905 to January 1st, 1909, 300,000 people fell away from the Orthodox Church. In the Kingdom of Poland, it is mainly in Holbrus, 160,000 people converted to the Roman Catholic confession, 1/3 of all former Greek Catholics. The statistics are especially impressive for Siedlec province, where the number of Orthodox Christians has been almost halved in 3 years. Many former Unionists who had previously converted to Orthodoxy only on paper remained Catholics in their hearts and hurried to return to the faith of their ancestors as soon as it was allowed. It happened that in a few days they built Catholic churches out of planks. However, sincere believers have also fallen away from Orthodoxy. Thousands of church elders and members of church communities. Beyond doubt, the Catholic pressure, which was mentioned earlier, played a role here. This was the situation in Belarus, Ukraine, and the whole region by the end of the Russian Empire. Under the powerful pressure of proselytism and propaganda, people lost their faith and then their nationality too. As Bishop Yevlogy said, the confused and terrorized people ran to the Catholic Church to finally bury the last remnants of their national and religious identity there. That's where the roots of separatism are, which eventually led to the fact that Ukraine and Belarus, being native Russian lands, turned out to be separate states.